Welcome back, everyone. I'm Julia, your host of the Mentorship podcast, a series that features diverse industry professionals. We mentor you by highlighting various fields and breaking down each step of our guest's career path, from high school to their current role. In today's episode, we are joined by Michal Malyska, a machine learning scientist and engineer. Michal came to Canada as an international student from Poland. He received a Bachelor of Science in Math and Statistics from the University of Toronto. He then completed a Master of Science in Statistics at UofT as well. During this time, he joined a startup called Semantic Health as its first employee, where he worked as a machine learning scientist. In this conversation, Michal talks about his experience as an international student, as well as career trajectory changes from wanting to be an actuary to discovering machine learning. Plus, he gives an inside perspective into working at a startup. And there's so much more. So now, here to mentor us, it is Michal Malyska. Welcome, Michal, to the Mentorship podcast. Thank you so much for being here. How are you feeling?
Thank you for having me. And I'm doing quite all right.
I'm excited to have you here and to go through your career. We're going to be starting right from the beginning so that we can really get to know you. My first question for you is, what did you want to be when you grew up, and what kind of things interested you when you were younger?
Okay, I think the first major thing where I was convinced I will have a career, I always wanted to be in theoretical physics.
Okay.
Growing up and all of my, middle school, high school friends, we were always into physics and thinking about hey, can we do more advanced math? And then going to university, aiming for places like Caltech, and trying to break into that.
How did you get exposed to physics, especially in middle school? Thinking back to middle school for me, I don't think I knew what physics was.
I guess because I was in a Polish education system, middle school already had physics as I don't know if it was part of general science, but it was definitely part of curriculum from grade 7.
Okay, nice.
Something along those lines. So I was slightly exposed, but my actual passion and the true exposure to the fun side of physics was just popular science books.
Okay.
So the Richard Feynman's 6 Easy Pieces, whatever was translated into Polish back then. I did not speak English at all.
Yeah.
So those popular science books really drove the start of that passion.
So then did you do your schooling in a different country and then you came here at a certain time to Canada?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I did all of my up until high school. I did high school, I did the IB program. Okay. That's where I knew I wanted to study abroad. Mm-hmm. I thought I would end up in the UK.
Okay.
And most people because it's just easier. It back then it was EU. It was very convenient sort of place to go for really good universities. And then sometime late in high school, me and then my then girlfriend were talking, and she wanted to go to the States for school. I'm like, okay, that's a consideration now. And yeah, I ended up in Canada. At UofT.
Wow, that's a big jump, a big decision at that time. Were you learning English? Because you just said that at the beginning you didn't know English. So how was that process too? Because then you're coming here more as an adult as opposed to a child, right? Yeah. So definitely when I arrived here, my English was decent. Okay. Because of IB, right?
I did IB for high school. Coming into IB, my English was not great. It wasn't horrible, and in Poland it's you have mandatory education. You learn English from the first day of school.
Yeah.
But it's the usual second language learning. So and the media English media just didn't exist back then in Poland to the extent it does now. So basically everything I've consumed was in Polish.
Okay.
So coming here was a little bit of a struggle at first, I think, still. But ultimately, what really contributed to how my English is now is I was still young, and there's no Polish people at UofT. Mm-hmm. So it was like immediate, like very deep immersion.
Yeah, just throwing yourself in, basically.
Yeah, like I didn't have the option of speaking Polish to anyone but my family, and like that's gonna happen once a week.
Yeah.
On a daily basis, it was just English.
Okay, so let's talk about that transition then. So you kind of mentioned how you ended up looking over to North America, but how did you end up choosing UofT specifically, and what kind of programs were you looking at, especially since, you know, your first interest was physics? So how did that go about?
First round of applications, I applied everywhere, right? Basically, just spray and pray on application side. I applied everywhere in the US. I applied to Canada, to UofT, to Waterloo. Like university, I had no idea about, right? Like I had no clue what UofT was, what Waterloo was. It's just, I look up the rankings, top universities in Canada. I apply, and, you know, hopefully the rankings actually matter.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a very well thought out and conscious process. I got into a couple places. I got into like Boston University, I think was the highest ranked one. It was very expensive because international tuition. I didn't get any scholarships, and that year I didn't go to university. I actually took a gap year for, I guess, many reasons. I wanted to improve my SATs. I wanted to, just like prep better, do this process in a little bit more structured way. And the second benefit was my girlfriend was a year below me. So she was still in high school. Then we did like a very planning thing of like, basically we applied to universities that are clustered together geographically.
Yeah.
So even if we don't go to the same place, we would be fairly close.
Yeah.
And she ended up at Carnegie Mellon. I ended up at UofT. Lesson learned, like we moved here, and I think September first year we broke up. So
it's still a little bit of a distance. Like,
yeah,
it's
it was significant. And especially back then, I couldn't enter the US, right? Like I was Polish. I would need a visa. So the original plan was to meet in like Niagara Falls or something like halfway through.
Yeah.
But
that's
never
tough.
happened.
Yeah,
right?
that's
like,
really tough.
But yeah, I ended up at UofT, and I think it was a sort of a stroke of luck.
Yeah.
Because I think if I ended up in the US, I would be back in Poland right now with like how hard it is to stay there.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's just like very luck-based decision. And yeah, I'm going to be Canadian in like 2 years, right? Like
that's amazing. So then you started at UofT. I mean, there's so many questions I could ask. First, I can imagine the culture shock, just adjusting. Like you said, you were still learning English and getting used to everything. So first, maybe just if you want to touch on how it was just as an international student, adjusting how you found UofT, and then we'll get more into your courses and your program.
Yeah. So I guess it was like a giant culture shock. Poland is very like monocultural, right? Warsaw, not as much, but right, like I've known like one or two Vietnamese people in high school, and that was it, right? Like everyone else is Polish. It was honestly a little intimidating at first, especially with what I thought back then was like quite poor English. In retrospect, it really wasn't, but back then Facebook was still a big thing. So I made friends with one of the guys in all of my courses over like a UofT, like the newly admitted Facebook group.
Yeah.
And we were in like almost all the same classes. He was also like Eastern European background. So we would hang out, and like that helped quite a bit. And then just doing frosh, right? Like actually living on res and doing frosh did wonders for actually having a social life and being less intimidated to like speak with people.
Yeah, even getting involved in social and student groups and stuff like that too could be really helpful, which we can definitely talk about. But let's go over then how you ended up choosing your program, because we've talked about this a bit before on the podcast. We've had some UofT alums who did their undergrad there, and UofT is really interesting because you can either do a specialized program and focus just on primarily one subject, or otherwise they require you to do the 2 majors or major and 2 minors. Usually in your first year, if you're going the non-specialized route, you're kind of testing out different subjects. By the end of it, you choose what your 2 majors are going to be and so on. So how was that process for you? What did you end up choosing?
Yeah, so I guess at that point, I have already made somehow a switch from physics to I want to be an actuary.
Okay.
It's more it's the same sort of dumb idea that I had of like, let's look at what the best professions are. And let's, right, like an actuary was back then like, oh, this is the like top profession. It was advertised as being like very mathematical, but still sort of closer to earth, right? Like it's for anyone that doesn't know, it's insurance math.
Okay.
It's basically pricing of insurance, looking at how long people are going to live, all that jazz.
Is it insurance for anything, like auto insurance, car insurance,
Yes.
life insurance?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so I picked courses, like I didn't really have a strong choice in terms of courses, because to get into the actuarial courses in second year, you had like certain prerequisites. And then if you want to fulfill all of the other criteria, like the, I don't remember what they're called, but like, they're like, you have to have like a ethics component, etc. If you want to fulfill that, like it's better to get it out early on. So my first year was like basically constrained to the exact courses I was taking.
Oh, okay.
Which was like econ, philosophy. I picked German as like a foreign language, math, econ, and then the breadth requirements. That's what they're called.
Yeah.
That let me get my degree, and then like later on I get to choose the actual cool courses and like things I actually want to do.
Okay. You ended up choosing math and statistics to be your major, and is that just because that's a normal path to become an actuary?
No. So I was in like there was like a first year learning community for actuarial science. I was in the actuarial special, like, right, so after the first year you declare your program.
Okay.
And you declare like I tried the actuarial science specialist, right? So it's the mono degree.
Yeah.
With I wanted to do 2 minors on top of that. One was in CS, one was in German, just because I was already in the German class and like it went kind of well. That's it. And I still thought I would be coming back to Europe after university. So knowing German is a big plus. Came back, did second year. In second year, you start taking the actuarial courses. Like you actually learn the basics of, I guess back then it was financial math and probability. And to be an actuary, you need to pass a lot of like professional exams. And to be a competitive candidate for the internships and the jobs, you had to have the exams before you actually took the classes that are meant to prepare you.
Oh, okay.
So I spent like early second year just grinding out like exam questions. It's it's basically like test taking skills.
Is it external to university?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So you have to like buy software that just gives you practice questions. You practice the questions for a couple of months. You take the exam. You get your you passed paper, and then you put that on your resume, and you have a very decent chance at that point of actually getting internships. And it became very, very insanely competitive. Kind of like a race to the bottom, where if you want to be get the most work for the more prestigious companies, you want to be the best, and so you're gonna push no matter what. So in second year, I actually got the internship I really wanted. It was at Intact Financial, or like Bel Air, right? Like it's Intact subsidiary in car insurance. Back then I realized I don't want to do life insurance. It's a little bit more boring. Car insurance moves a little faster. So I got that internship, and as an example of how competitive it was getting, the other intern on my team was straight out of high school. He didn't start university. He had one professional exam already passed.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So that's a tough culture to be in. Yeah.
And the job was all right? It's Excel. It's standard-ish office job, requires a little bit of stats. And the team was incredible. Like the people that were working there, they were super fun. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with the people. The job itself was monotone and boring to me.
Yeah.
And second year was a very tough time for me, generally, because things just started catching up, right? Like you're trying to push so hard. If one thing starts going wrong, everything starts going wrong.
Yeah, because everything is constrained to such little time. The semester is only 4 months. Yeah. Yeah,
and I guess I have always tried to be the overachiever. I think it's like a typical like immigrant, like fresh immigrant stuff. I know how much my parents are paying in international tuition.
Yes.
I'm going to get everything I can out of it. So, for example, I was president of the Stats Union. I was the like president of my like res house.
Oh, okay.
So I had like, again, like great friends on res. The building was kind of abysmal. So as a president, I got the bigger room. It was on the 13th floor. And then elevators broke down in like October.
Okay.
So there's 13 floors down to walk to class.
Yeah.
And to get food because we didn't have a kitchen. And I think that was one of the like major contributors to like me starting to skip class because like I don't want to, right? Especially in winter, you put on the thick coat, you walk down, you get like an hour of class, then you go back, you go back down, etc., etc. Fairly minor inconvenience actually was the start of a spiral of like, I'm going to skip class because like, okay, I can learn on my own and pick things up. My grades started sliding and it started becoming like, I became anxious. Ultimately in like December, they told us that the elevators would be fixed when we come back in January. I came back in January from Christmas break from Poland and the elevators weren't fixed. Okay. And so I'm like, okay, I need to look for an apartment.
Yeah.
So looking for an apartment, right? Like I'm skipping classes to look for a new place to live.
Wow.
Found an incredible deal, like super close to UofT with a lovely Ukrainian landlord who just like, incredible people. Again, I was very lucky, but I was already sort of down that spiral of like, things aren't going great. I have way too much on my plate and I'm just not doing well.
Yeah.
So that was like a very low point for me in terms of mental health. I ultimately ended up like not taking some of my exams due to anxiety. Was on like got prescribed like anti-anxiety medication. And the only thing that was going really well for me was my grades in statistics.
Okay.
And it was, part of it was like, it just an easy subject.
Yeah.
Like I really loved the instructors. But then my internship started right at Intact at that point and everything started moving, right? Like it started feeling better, right? Like I started to gain momentum on the up. So I had to sit down and sort of reevaluate, right? Like where I was at that point, where is this really what I want to do? Do I want to push this hard on exams, actuarial science? Is like, how is this going to impact my life in the future? And I realized like, I don't need the actuarial science degree as long as I have the exams, right? Like nobody really cares that I took the classes because the classes are meant to prepare you for the exams.
Right.
If I already have the exams, if I have to pass them before I take the class, why am I doing the classes? So I decided I'm going to switch to a stats program. I realized, okay, I want to be qualified. Like what can be my niche, right? And I figured that like my spin on my career is going to be, I am the actuary that actually knows like advanced stats, like advanced, like I guess back then machine learning wasn't really like a big thing, but like advanced modeling, right?
Yeah.
And that seemed interesting. It's a very complicated topic. It's fairly mathematical, but I felt that it was like very within reach for me. So that's the spin I'm gonna put. A niche, which was a very good choice, right? Like that landed me my consulting job. So in the third year, I was going to a career fair and I met a guy from Deloitte who was just standing around kind of bored. And I approach him and I just like start chatting with him, not about actuarial science, just like, hey, what do you do? Like, and then he asked me, right? He got a little bit more engaged. He asked me what I do. I sold him on my spin. Like, hey, I'm in stats program. I'm interested in actuarial science, but like, I'm much more on the modeling side. This is what I want to do. And he said, okay, you should talk to my like senior consultant, go for coffee with him. And later on I get an offer, right? Like I totally didn't have the idea. And they're like, we want you to start in January, right? Like we don't want you to start in the summer. Like as an international student, I could only work full-time in the summer. So I tell them like, hey, I can't do full-time while I'm in school. So they brought me on part-time for the first 4 months and then full-time over the summer. And I was doing, again, like that was a new like Deloitte office, right? Like it's consulting, it's prestigious. And it was like a 25% raise over what I was making at Intact. So right, like Intact wanted me to come back, but I immediately, right, like that's a lot of money when you're a student.
Plus a different experience, better
prestige.
Building for your resume, things like that. Were you in the financial district too?
Yeah. It was in like the Bay Adelaide. Like the I think part of why like I really wanted to work there, I was watching Suits, the TV show, and it was filmed in that office.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, because I feel like in general, people who are in anything related to finances, whether it be financial math, stats, a lot of them have this vision that they want to be in the financial district on the Bay Adelaide corridor. Suits definitely made it popular too. And I'm speaking for, people who are in the Toronto culture too. So I was interested to hear if that was kind of at the forefront of your mind and, made it even more appealing.
It definitely was. Yeah. It was right. It was very like, and to be honest, right, as an immigrant, that like to me that signaled success, right? To like, I still had a very strong belief that like if you work right at Deloitte, you're sort of at the top of right? Like you can't go past. Like that's the perfect place to be, right? Like if you work really hard, you're gonna, be a good consultant.
Yeah, it's definitely on a pedestal for many people. And it's interesting because I do know some people who have gone that route, but then they ended up leaving for multiple reasons. Maybe their interest changed and whatnot, but I would love to hear how it ended up going for you. Did it exceed your expectations or fulfill them? And did you get any other different perspectives as well?
Yeah, so I guess I came in and like I really want to do consulting, right? Like I'm going to be an actuary. Modeling is my thing. And back, right, like the first 4 months at Deloitte, I was part-time and I was participating in audits.
Okay.
Which is the most boring thing I can imagine because it's not even you're looking at like pricing, it's you're checking other people's numbers, right? It's like the least creative work you can imagine. And it's just like, it was super, super, super boring. Again, like very nice people, but I really didn't like the Deloitte culture of like constantly playing politics. And like, I wanted to work on a cool project on the analytics side, right? I want to do modeling. I don't want to do audits. And I basically got yelled at by the senior manager of like, why is my resource doing something else where we have billable hours on audit projects that benefit me?
It's very almost limiting in a way. And, sometimes corporate jobs can be like that because you have your roles and you stick to your roles. And sometimes it hinders your creative freedom.
Yeah, and it was a little, I guess it was a little disheartening. Then for the summer, I was actually deployed client side on like one of the big insurance companies. Around that time, the new Deloitte AI practice was being started. It was called like AI Omnia, and they were bringing in people that do machine learning, and they wanted to start the AI consulting side. So I tried to take advantage of it as much as possible by just meeting with the people they were hiring. And I met a lot of cool people who were doing modeling for non-insurance. And that seemed so much cooler than like, hey, I'm doing audits or like I'm looking through for like databases of the insurance company to like figure out what's actually in their book of business. So that was like sort of sparked me to like, I just want to do modeling. Like, let's ditch this actuarial stuff. It's clearly, right? Like I can have the same level of success in my head, right? Like I can be at Deloitte, I can still be a consultant, and I can do the stuff that is cooler to me.
Yeah.
So at the end of that term, like I got a return offer, like for if you want to come back to Deloitte. And so this is like after third year, I didn't know if I wanted to do that. I realized that like if I want to come back, I would probably want to come back in the AI side. I need a graduate degree.
Okay.
So I really lean hard into I need to improve my grades, right? The grades for third year and fourth year is what matters for grad school. So in fourth year, first thing, you need recommendations, right?
Yes.
That's so hard to get in a program where there's 6,000 stat students. A lot of them want to go to grad school. Profs don't really know you. So you have to start showing up to class. You have to start talking to people. TAing helped because I developed some relationships with profs. I started TAing like upper year courses. So in fourth year, I was TAing third years. So I was TAing some of my actuarial friends that wanted to learn machine learning. I was a TA. Yeah, but like I got my recommendations. But part of the problem, because I was an international student, I would be applying as an international student into statistics. So as an international student, I was applying for grad schools and I wanted to go keep at UofT. I applied to a couple other places, but like realistically, I wanted to stay at UofT, just do my master's. I was an international student, and the number of spots for full-time master's international students was a nice round 0.
Oh.
Because all of the, like, I don't know the exact details. The way I understood it was that the funding was dedicated to PhD students, and like international masters, because it was a funded program, like there's just, it doesn't make sense for the department to spend money on course-based masters when they can fund a PhD student that does research and actually contributes to the department.
Yeah.
So I actually got into the part-time master's program at UofT in stats. And I figured like with what I do, like I can push hard and like instead of 8 months, I can get it done in like 12 or maybe 16.
Yeah.
So it's not really, it doesn't slow me down much. I get like fairly certain admission into it. It is then paid, so I had to pay for my master's, but compared to undergrad tuition, it was nothing.
Oh, okay.
Because it was, I think the whole master's program was about as expensive as one term of undergrad.
Right. So was it research based where you were doing research? Okay, it was course based.
It was course based, but so in fourth year I was like, I realized like I want to do like really cool stuff, and there's no super cool classes in undergrad. They're not letting me take the grad school courses, right? There's some cross-listed courses in the stats department, but the like really cool stuff is grad students only, and you're not gonna get in. But I applied to be in what's it's like a one-on-one style course with a prof, right? So you have to beg to get into it because the prof doesn't get anything, right? They don't get more funding. It's a purely like they spend time with you, but it's a directed course where you have to make up the syllabus. You approach the prof and like, hey, here's what I want to learn.
Oh.
Can you be the prof for this? It's called a reading course. That's what it, sorry.
Okay.
So you usually come up and like you find a textbook, right? Something that's like easy to follow, that's very low effort for the prof.
Yeah.
And they supervise you, whether one-on-one or like one in a couple, right? Like we grabbed a group of ambitious friends who wanted to do things, and we approached Professor Dan Simpson, who was like a new hire at UofT back then, who was a Bayesian stats god, like very famous name in that area. So like we want to do Bayesian stats. There's no Bayesian like big classes in undergrad. Let's figure out the best like textbook for it. We all bought the textbook. We approached him like, hey, here's what we want to do. Here's what we want to learn. Can you do this for us? And so we met with him every week. We would do like projects. It wasn't research, but it was like implement something or like show something. That was really good. And like, that's ultimately how we formed like pretty good relationships. The other one was with my now I consider a mentor, Professor David Duvenod. And then I would just do projects with David.
Oh, okay.
And we picked a paper that like he was interested in, like something that seemed fishy about it. Where like this, like it, like intuitively, it wasn't a super nice and intuitive result. And so the idea was like, can we test out if this is actually true, like empirically?
Right.
So I was doing that on the side. So I was doing these 2 reading classes that are like the actual cool things, right? Like these things I wanted to learn. Then I finish, I graduate. And around the time I graduate, I get approached by a friend who is like very entrepreneurial in spirit. And he goes like, Michael, I have a friend. He has a startup idea. He needs an NLP guy.
Okay.
And you did natural language processing. You're smart. You're have this entrepreneurial spirit. You guys should go get food. So I grab, right, like the friend of a friend was Nick, who became my CEO, right? We went for food. We almost didn't make the meeting. Like he was sick. We got food. We got along really well.
Nice.
And he had a really good startup idea, sort of like what I was looking for. So a vaguely boring business that can be made significantly less unpleasant with the use of technology.
Okay.
And so we got along super well. And in like 2019, we immediately started hacking things together. Okay. So we would sit in like St. Michael's College, like study rooms on our laptops, just like trying to put something together on the technology side for the startup. And so in September, I start grad school, but I'm like, okay, now I'm going to be working at a startup. It's not super wise to do push as hard on my part-time master's and try and, startups are notorious for bad hours and a lot of effort.
Yeah.
And I was very passionate about what we were doing, right? It was the coolest thing I've ever seen at that point. It was a super complex problem on the machine learning side, brand new technology, right? Because back then, NLP was starting to take off, right? So it's a super cool skill, super cool problem. Very, very smart CEO. He was an ER doctor with the most insane work ethic I've ever seen in a single person, who was gave up on residency to run a startup.
Okay, so the friend of the friend that became the CEO, he wasn't a student. He was well into his...
he finished med school and then he basically gave up on residency to start have a company.
Okay. And what was the problem that the company was focused on and working towards solving?
So I guess I have a spiel because I've done this so many times, but when you're a patient and you show up to a hospital, hospital spends resources on treatment, right? Whether they do MRIs, whatever they do, right? Doctor's time, et cetera, and the way hospitals get reimbursed here in Canada, at least partially, is through the hospital has some college-educated people called medical coders who are going to take the patient chart, read what happened in the hospital stay, and they're going to assign insurance billing codes. They're called ICD. It's International Classification of Diseases codes. They're going to manually assign them, add some more detail, and that gets submitted as sort of the insurance claim.
Okay.
And so the goal was, right, patient chart can be 400 pages of text.
Yeah.
And you need to find up to 20 most relevant diagnoses. And there's 370,000 possible diagnoses. So it's basically a very manual process of looking for keywords, right?
And it was all
manual.
on paper too.
I think historically it was on paper back when we were starting, electronic health records were starting to become a thing.
Yeah.
And so there was an incumbent in the space, a big company, 3M, that provided software that helped, right? Basically helps display the patient chart and helps assign the billing codes, but there were no suggestions, right? Okay. The idea was we can help suggest the ICD codes and we can provide evidence from text so that the coder doesn't have to sit and sift through 400 pages of text to find the codes. We're just going to point them to the right spaces. They validate, right? They just say this is true or not. And then ultimately the long-term plan was we can automate it, right? With enough training data, the medical coder is going to need to do less and less and ultimately do nothing. So we started on that. It was super cool. I joined as the first employee, right? So I wasn't a co-founder. I was the first guy in the door. And then COVID hit, right?
Okay.
And suddenly there's new insurance billing codes for COVID. Right? And we were starting to get a lot of uptake on the product.
Right.
We raise money. We start hiring more people. I'm suddenly leading a team, right? I'm a manager with a year of work experience where I have two of, I guess, my acquaintances working on my team, building DML product. And then I'm still in grad school, but I'm putting all my chips in the startup basket. But I still did well. I think at that point, I really knew how to study and how to do. But ultimately, at that point, I'm leaning into the machinery. I have this super cool problem. I'm working with very smart people. The new VP engineering that we hired became a very close personal friend to me now, and I guess what I would consider my other mentor in life, and building a relationship at work. And I think I learned more in that first year at Semantic than I learned in all of school.
And that's common for startups too, right? Yeah. Because you get thrown in, and even how you were saying after a year, you were leading a team. And that's, one of the advantages of startups is that you can get into these more responsible positions earlier in your career because you have the skill set and because you have the opportunity too.
I would argue with because you have the skill set, it's you have the ability to quickly build the skill set, right? Like sometimes you get dropped in front of a customer in a call and like you've never talked to any customer, right? Like you don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to figure it out.
It pushes you to learn the skill set much faster than, you know, in a more broader industry.
Yeah, it essentially doesn't let you slack off at work, right? Like it's not, right? It takes a very specific kind of person to excel in that environment. I think the vast majority of people have like a little bit too low risk tolerance to do it in the first place, right? Like, because going for a startup, 99% of the time, you're going to have worked for a company that nobody has heard of and making very little money off of it.
Yeah.
Right? And working crazy hours because startups require fairly crazy hours. So it was a big risk, and also, right, like it's a very fuzzy job, right? Like am I a product manager? Am I a machine learning engineer? Am I a people manager?
Yeah.
You kind of wear a lot of hats. That builds your skill set very, very quickly. And my reasoning personally for like why I wanted to do it is I get to do cool stuff now. I get to develop. I get to take a big chance at, you know, possibly a lot of money down the line, right? If I own equity in the company, in case of like a big exit, right? Like if the company IPOs, I can retire, right? Or realistically, what I would do now is, right, you can put money back in the ecosystem and fund other startups doing cool things. And actually, right, here in Toronto, the venture ecosystem is still fairly small, but growing, of like people who want to just do cool things, right? Like benefit everyone and just by building things.
Yeah.
And I think that community is, I guess, what I missed in like my search for like what I want to do. I think I found it. Again, I think at that, like the biggest turning point was after Deloitte, where I stopped like picking a path based off of something else, right? Where I look up what's the most prestigious career and I go for it. It was more, I am here right now. What is the like small step that takes me in the direction that I like more than what I'm doing now? And sort of that like small incremental changes took me to like a much better place than I think I would have ever been able to go if I kept trying to make these like large outsized bets on like without doing a lot of research, or even with doing a lot of research. I think I learned that like the best way for me to optimize my path is to look at the opportunities I have right now and just lean into the best one.
Yeah.
And ultimately like try and open myself up to as many opportunities as possible right now. And then I don't really need to worry about the far future because predicting it is basically impossible.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
And you're building your experience, and then in the future you have more opportunities, more positions that you can apply to that you didn't before. That's like one really big advantage about startups. I feel like you get so much exposure and then you have more opportunities after.
Yes and no. I think part of it is, for example, right now, I am applying to a lot of places, right? I left Semantic at the end of last year. I took some time teaching, then finally did my grad trip post-COVID. If the startup isn't super well known, it's very difficult to have like strongly validated credentials, right? So you're going to do really well in interviews, but getting the interviews is the more difficult part. Because, right, like people screen resumes based off of ultimately like status, right? What you look like on paper.
Yeah.
And startups don't look very well on paper unless you make it like really big.
Yeah.
But then you don't need to worry about the job anyway.
Yeah.
So it is a big risk in that regard where possibly going for like a big brand first and then going startups might be a better career pathway
to start building
right? Just
your
like
resume.
To have the like you just have a better backup. But I think the kind of people who tend to go, especially for early stage startups, you need to have a certain amount of ego, and if you have that ego, you're always going to be like, no matter what happens, I can handle it, right? Like it's it's fine, right? Like, you need to understand where you stand, and like, if you're smart and hardworking, you'll be fine no matter what, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you're in a profession like machine learning. I was working with very smart people. There was no politics. It was very meritocratic in a sense where we would argue all the time, right? Like, it was constant arguing, especially with the VP engineering, who was just hammering into me like good practices, right? Like, you care about the product, not about the cool technology. But it was very like, yeah, like it wasn't politics. It was like truth seeking. It was, we want to arrive at the best decision, and we're going to argue until we're there, right? And we're going to write things down. And I think that environment is so incredibly rare in professional workspaces, especially in a bigger corporations, where suddenly there's politics, people want advancement, people have like very narrow jobs, people have a lot more power. So it becomes a lot more difficult to engage in this type of behavior. And it still exists in like specific teams in bigger corporations, but I don't think it's part of the culture. I think that's the big part that's keeping me in the venture space. And while I'll likely like spend probably most of the rest of my life in startup-y environments.
Yeah, it's a different environment for sure, a different culture. And so because you mentioned that you kind of transitioned out of that startup, what is your path looking like now?
That is a very good question. I still don't know. I'm interviewing for a lot of companies. It's all startups, basically. Some bigger corporations that have this like startup-y feel to them. What I actually end up doing is I had a big realization that, to me now, like the modeling part that was so core to my identity, it's a tool. It's not like the core of my values. It's something I can leverage to build things. And so my focus in my career has shifted. I just want to build cool things with cool people. And it sounds like a very like, I don't know, like weirdly privileged position, like, oh yeah, I don't care about like money right now, or I don't care about like stability. I just want to build cool things with cool people. But I feel like if you're surround yourself with people that are very smart, very talented, very hardworking, right? Like the top of the startup community, you're sort of destined for success no matter what. And it's worth taking that risk.
Yeah, you can look for something that's really going to fuel you and your passion and give you that spark in a way.
And yeah, just like I guess my values shifted so much. And yeah, part of it is like I think that was part of like being really integrated into the culture here, and like thinking less like I'm a new immigrant. My parents spend a lot of money getting me here. I'm just going to try and fulfill what I think would make them happy and like confident in where I am. I'm just going to do sort of what I want.
Yeah, make yourself happy. Yeah.
And like it's always I still think like it's a consideration we're having of like making myself happy is one thing, but you still need, right, like financial stability. You need to, right, like I wouldn't want to go for a job where my parents like spend every day worrying about me. So it's definitely, and I think it should be a consideration. I think the setup of like just worry about yourself and like it's gonna be fine, I don't think that's completely right. But having the like confidence to pursue things that like are closer to what you really want while making those considerations. And to be honest, if you're smart and if you're hardworking, if you find your niche, you're going to be fine no matter what. And sort of try to make the most out of it in the moment. I think I spent way too much time on career development and like pushing so hard into, right, like getting internships, passing professional exams, getting hundreds in courses, where ultimately now from like 5-8 years later, it wasn't worth it, right? Like I wish I allocated my time differently and I hung out with people more, I dated more, I went to the gym more. And I think that's like against the advice of so many people.
No,
but,
I think people do. I feel like the advocation for balance is, a lot more prominent now. And I think people would really appreciate that, especially anyone in university, whether they be in undergrad, grad school, professional school right now. I know that they would benefit from hearing, give yourself time, balance everything, take care of yourself. And I appreciate you mentioning too, like the transitional period that you're in right now, because I think it is part of the process. No career is linear, even though we try so hard when we're younger to think that everything's going to be linear and there's an end goal that's going to be right there waiting for us if we follow the steps. Overall, challenges are going to come up and things are going to be untraditional in a way, and it's a part of the journey, right? It's important to take that time to let yourself grow, to find what works best for you too. And so because of that, I feel like this is a great place for me to ask my last question. I feel like we've touched on it already, but in case you have anything else to add, my last question for you is, what are your hopes for your future career development, and what do you hope to achieve?
I don't think I have a very good answer.
That's okay.
I think, right, like especially long term, I think maybe that's possibly I've leaned a little too hard into like I optimize in the moment, and like I think about like where I'm gonna be 90 days from now significantly more than I think where I'm gonna be in 5 years or in 10 years. But I think like I used to deal with my anxiety by obsessively planning the future, right? Like obsessively writing down all the possible paths and like things I can do, and ultimately it never works, right? Because the opportunities you have right now versus where you're going to be in 5 years, it's so vastly different. And if you overplan, right? Like if you lean too hard into actuarial science, like I did, you might miss a lot of the opportunities along the way, right? Like you're just going to be blind to them because you have tunnel vision on that dream that you've made 5 years ago. Yeah. So right now I'm in the like I want to do build cool things with cool people, and hopefully like contribute to the community here in Toronto, like build up Toronto tech, hang out with people more. Those are the things I really think about, and then I don't really sweat the big picture.
I feel like when I ask this last question, sometimes it could be perceived as, like a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. But I think even just your perspective and understanding that you want to build cool things with cool people is a hope and a career goal in itself. Just knowing what your drive is and where you want to center yourself and what you want your work to be centered on and your passion to be centered on, I think is, the most important thing.
Yeah, hopefully. Hopefully I'm getting that right. Maybe 5 years from now I'm going to have regrets about what I'm doing now. But
yeah, you never know. Yeah. Well, Michael, it was so nice having you on. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I even appreciate the parts where you were more vulnerable and telling us about your challenges, because I know that people are going to relate to it, and it gives the whole perspective too, right? It's not about just taking the courses, getting the grades, and getting the job. There's life that goes on within that too. So I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for, I guess, allowing me to rant for so many like long-winded answers. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to Michael for coming on the podcast. This was such a great conversation on so many different levels. I have also experienced changing career trajectories and getting really fixated on a certain job or career. So I really appreciated Michael talking about that experience of wanting to be an actuary and then ending up exploring other paths that he felt more passionate about. I also really loved getting a little bit deeper in this episode and Michael's vulnerability in talking about some of the challenges and mental health struggles that he went through during his undergrad and career. I think this is probably the deepest we've gone on this podcast, and it's so important because a career path is not just about each educational step and job that we achieve and we go through. It's also about the challenges in between, going through those struggles and figuring out how we can conquer them in order to create a well-rounded career for us. And of course, hearing about the startup as well, I feel like Michael was very open and transparent even about the challenges of a startup and some of the disadvantages as well. We've had people come on before who are founders of startups or founding members or employees of startups, and I think we focused a lot on the positive sides. So to hear both the positives and some challenges as well, I think hopefully gives some insight to you as well on the different angles of it. So I think this was a really great conversation. There was a lot to take from it, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next episode. Please also make sure that you follow or subscribe on whatever platform you are listening on. In the meantime, follow us on @MentProjects on all social media platforms for updates and more mentorship resources. We also have an anonymous feedback form in our episode description that you can complete and tell us what you are interested in hearing more about in future episodes. We would really appreciate your feedback, and thank you so much for listening.